Good morning. My name is Stephanie Hyde. I'm the CEO for JLL in the UK, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here to join us this morning, and welcome to those that I believe are also joined online. So we're here to learn and hear about purpose and this amazing new standard that's been developed. Never more important than it is in the world that we're in, I think, with the economic, the social, the environmental challenges that are there. And business has been thinking about this, talking about this, wanting to move into this space. Some of them have already made significant moves, but without real guidance and understanding of how to take it forward and to really put it at the centre of their organisations for many. So I'm looking forward to today. We're going to have a couple of opening remarks from John Hurst, the chairman of the BSI, followed by Dr. Victoria Hirth, who was the author, the technical author for the standard. When I think back on my career, I had 25 years at one of the big four firms and worked with hundreds of companies. And over that time, it was interesting to see some thinking about purpose, and those that moved ahead more looking at purpose, you could tell, because their employees were more focused, they were more connected to their stakeholders, and they had something that they could hold themselves accountable to. And I think that's really important. At JLL, our purpose is to shape the future of real estate for a better world. And we do that in lots of different ways. We think about how we build communities, how we shape places that people want to live, work and play. And certainly we're thinking about it very strongly in the environmental context. The built environment creates 40% of carbon footprint and has a huge responsibility, and we see that we have a very big responsibility to lead in that space. But we're also on a journey, and we know that we can learn a lot from others, we can learn a lot from this standard, and so looking forward, as I said, to its release and also to being able to move forward with what we are trying to do as well. So I said that I would hand over to John. John joined the BSI as a non-executive director in October 2019 and became chair in 2 months later. My goodness, a quick acceleration. And John's got significant experience in transforming companies and really taking companies on a journey as well. So I'll hand over to John. Thank you very much for coming.
Good morning, everybody. I suspect that what I'm going to say is in this room and beyond is preaching to the converted, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's important. Purpose. Everyone needs one, and we always have. It's always been a source of inspiration and strategic clarity, and there is much evidence, as you've heard already, to show that purpose-driven organisations are successful organisations, and without being too deep about it, people with purpose seem to be always to be happier and content. But in business, too few have actually articulated it. Making money, or more elegantly put, creating shareholder value, has often been deemed enough. And for some it might be. And let's face it, making money is vital for all businesses to survive. But for a growing number of people, and particularly younger employees, there needs to be more. So that's made it quite fashionable, and many are scrambling to retrofit an explicit purpose to what they do and how they behave. And that can lead to suspicions and sometimes accusations of purpose washing, something that gets seen through pretty quickly in my experience. PAS 808, I think, represents a watershed moment and a real opportunity that such a diverse group of people could get together and pretty quickly were able to agree and codify in some detail the key elements of a purpose-driven organisation shows, I think, in itself that we may be at an inflection point. The standard sets out key terms and the principles and behaviours we can look for and support. It also goes one stage further to outline the fundamental worldviews that underpin this way of thinking. This should demystify what good looks like and why, and provide an accountability framework so stakeholders can understand and measure progress and adherence. So it can help organisations express and codify their purpose and demonstrate delivery against it. I am particularly proud as chairman of BSI that this has come to fruition. It started some 2 years ago, and that might seem like a long time, but actually in a world of standards this is quite fast. But I have not, in my tenure as chairman, been present for the launch of a more important standard for me personally anyway. So you're very welcome, and I look forward to the rest of this morning's discussion. My job now is to introduce Dr. Victoria Hirth. Now, if you're called Hurst, saying Hirth sounds a bit like a lisp, but it's not, and we are not related. She is technical author of PAS 808, fellow of the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership, and visiting fellow, University of Cambridge Judge Business School. Victoria, we're in your hands. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah, this is a really important occasion. Thank you, John, for your words. You set that scene beautifully, and it's really great to know that on a personal level this is something that really matters, and I think this is something that matters for all of us. Technical author, first of all, just to say it's a title in BSI. It just means that I put the words down and said, is this what we mean? And then people go, maybe, is this what we mean? And then we got there, and so really in service to an amazing group of people. So today does mark that watershed moment. We have the first national standard on purpose-driven organisations. Yay! Yeah. And it's been created by a really committed group of experts, but in service to a much wider community. We always, we were bringing in frameworks and thinking that connected, but it went as, really broad and in service to people who've been working on this topic and topics of sustainable organizations for decades, as well as all those who are increasingly becoming part of this critical movement. So I'm going to spend 11 short minutes just giving an overview of the standard. It's now out there, freely available, and thank you also to BSI for making the PAS freely available. It's a significant thing. It's not a small thing. It changes everything. So thank you, BSI, for that. Just to give an overview, you can all look at the standard. It's there, and that's the point of it. Implement it, work with it. Firstly, I'm going to outline the fact that one of the key clarifications that this standard brings about is the definition of organizational purpose. And this codifies two key aspects of being a PDO, purpose-driven organizations, at least two aspects. Firstly, that a PDO is at its core fundamentally aligned with sustainability. So here's the definition. And this, by the way, is a definition you could nest from an individual, project, team, government, any level, but at this point is it for an organization. A reason to exist that is an optimal strategic contribution to the long-term well-being of all people and planet. So the first thing that does is say, this is fundamentally aligned with sustainability. Purpose is fundamentally aligned. And that is because achieving the long-term well-being of all people and planet is actually the end goal of sustainability. It's a reworking of the Brundtland definition. It's the well-being of society as a whole is the point of an economy. And as was also said in the Brundtland report, ultimately this is the closest we're going to get in a way to humanity's meta-purpose. And that idea of this meta-purpose that we can all work towards is something really significant. So purpose is the answer to a problem. That's the reason we're talking about it and why it's not going away anywhere. Because that problem is unsustainability, where this collective long-term well-being is under existential threat. And this focus on well-being and on the good of another and others unborn is what makes purpose purposeful. And John, you mentioned that in what you talked about earlier. Because being in service to the good of another is the basis of a meaningful and a purposeful life, and it's our fundamental driver as a human being if we enable it to flourish. And it's this, for sure, that is the basis of why many people say that purpose-driven organizations, as Stephanie mentioned, are more productive, less stress, more stakeholder support, more resilience, more loyalty. I mean, you could go on, and we've got colleagues working on research very specifically in that. So purpose unlocks that. But the second key aspect in this definition, which is fundamental to purpose and one of its key powers, is that it is strategic. So it is not just a general commitment to doing good. It's not about serving all stakeholders in a general way. It's not, and we can talk about that one in more specifically detail. We'll come on to that. And it's not about doing something very specific that relates to well-being, but on the side, as a sideshow to financial income capture. So essentially, it is an optimal strategic contribution to that meta-purpose, along with some very clearly defined parameters for how you do that. And those being science-based and ethical, clear boundaries in which to be able to deliver that end goal. And it's that can be then the focus of governance, management, strategy making, decision making, and accountability most specifically. And that clarity, that strategic clarity, is what enables purpose-driven organizations to make really difficult decisions when things get tough. To be able to make the wise decision that they know is best for this goal, for the purpose, for the organization's future success when everyone else is telling them to do something different, that clarity. It also means that purpose is not the pet project of a manager. And this is one of the big reasons why, and one of the reasons why people push back against purpose and why we have the rationale for business as usual, as if doing something good would just be the pet project of a manager. This is a highly strategic, transparent, and accountabilityalizable, which is not a word, but there's something out there, but it's one of those, right? So it enables us to do that and to create that accountability frame, which is why we were able to write PAS 808 in the first place. So unsustainability is the biggest governance and management failure ever. And purpose-driven organizations give us the opportunity to correct that. So I'm now going to this triangle, it's an adapted version of Daly's triangle, Herman Daly, which was modified by Donella Meadows, some real, stalwarts of sustainability from a long time ago. And what this shows us is, and it's in the standard at the beginning, so you have time to digest it, but it also shows us how purpose is different to a normal business. So if we take this middle of the triangle, this is where the average business as usual, sits. We have created accountability frames and frames of decision making and strategy making that focus on the intermediate ends of financial and manufactured capital. This is what we govern, this is what we count, this is what we strategize against in the main. And that means that these organizations, which we could call CSR organizations, to the extent that they can only respond to unsustainability, to the extent that there's pressure to do so. And that pressure comes from the fact that there is a threat to the short-term financial income capture that the organization's focused on. And while that business case exists, action can be taken, otherwise it's difficult. What it does mean, however, is that this long-term well-being of all people and planet, i.e. sustainability, i.e. the end goals of the economy, are just not within the decision-making frame of this organization, and in fact, are outsourced to a set of ungoverned assumptions about how well-being is just magically created through the market. Ungoverned in terms of whether or not that actually works, but we also know that these foundational means, the stakeholders, the capital, and the fundamental environmental and social systems that uphold all of this value that ultimately improves our well-being is out of sight, out of mind, and off balance sheet. Now, some organizations are starting to recognize that actually they're not going to be around for anything but the short term, and they're not going to be able to create any kind of maximizing of financial income in the long term, or even now the medium term, if they don't care for their stakeholders, hence the dawn of stakeholder capitalism, if they don't care for their natural human and social capitals, these foundational capitals. And for the most enlightened organizations, because we could call these enlightened self-value, enlightened shareholder value, enlightened stakeholder value, for these enlightened, for the most enlightened, even starting to understand how they need to value these fundamental social and environmental systems. But we are very, very early on in that journey. And where we need to get to in a short period of time is obviously immense. So for CSR organizations, the law creates the boundaries and the parameters within which strategy is made. For enlightened organizations, they're starting to voluntarily create other parameters for strategy making that are based on valuing these capitals. But the ultimate ends are still out of sight, because the logic of the market and the way it creates well-being is the point. And so nothing will get through unless it works in terms of financial risk analysis. And that's what we see happening now, of course, with ISSB. How can we bring this into financial decision-making? And we talk about double materiality. In other words, the idea that an organization would care about its impact on the world, but there is no rationale for making any decision about that until you move to a purpose-driven mindset, where suddenly what absolutely matters is the impact of an organization on the world. So purpose makes a break with business as usual. As John, as you said, and I think we need to keep stating this because it does seem to get lost as if we don't realize this, that profits are absolutely critical. They're critical for paying your bills, for staying afloat, for investing in your purpose, and critically, for meeting the expectation of your stakeholders. And that includes what is a reasonable expectation around return on investment for those who invest their capital. But financial profits are important in order to achieve the purpose, which are the ends of a purpose-driven organization. And we have two principles in the standards that sit up here in these ends. But a purpose-driven organization is also enlightened. This is a long-term and a focus on well-being. So of course, this becomes a very natural part of the process to make sure that when achieving that purpose, that very specific organizational relevant contribution, the optimal strategic contribution to long-term well-being for all, that it's done within these parameters of ends. And we have two ends principles in the standard. But in achieving the ends and securing the means, it also really matters the way in which you do that. And so we have this other third section, which also provides parameters for strategy making around wise and ethical methods. So this is about making sure that the way that decisions are made really leans in to being as bold in innovation as possible, that also, but prudent when it comes to what we do around here, using the very best information that we can to do that, and making sure that how we treat people in the process is aligned with society's ethical values about how we treat people. So we can see that in this diagram. This is the diagram that is in the standard itself. We call it the egg diagram. I'm sure any eggs look like that, but it's, you know, it's useful. So I've blown it up here because it's a little bit easier to read. But you can see these are the principles, and those principles, so 7 in total, and those principles lead to the behaviors. And we focused very much on the behaviors of governing body and executive managers in order to enable behaviors throughout the organization. And the standard is normatively aligned to ISO 37000, which took 5 years to develop the first global standard on good governance of organizations. That I led that process with my co-convener, Axel Kravatsky, and that was launched in September. So there is a normative alignment to a whole standard on good governance that you can also use in conjunction. And this is great. And we have moved in standards building world from tick boxing of behaviours very, very deliberately into an idea that we need to look at principles. And the reason we did that is because otherwise you just get those discrete behaviours. You get no spillover, and you don't get the sort of, well, that wasn't really the point. You know, we wanted to change culture, actually, but we ended up just changing a few behaviours. So we've moved into an idea of principles. Let's look at principles, because then people actually have to think, how am I approaching a situation? You get a broader spectrum of behaviour change. But what sits behind principles are worldviews. Expectations, deeply held expectations and assumptions and beliefs about what is valuable in the world, how the world works, and how therefore we should act to protect it. And usually those are not exposed. But if your worldviews are not aligned with your principles, then you are going to hit brick walls all over the place. So in what I think is an innovation, because I don't know of another standard that starts with worldviews, that is what PAS 808 does. So if you're an organization and you're not sure, and you're worried about purpose washing, then looking at those worldviews and seeing, you know, it's not that all organizations will have all of them, but if you're not hitting a lot of those worldviews, starting with the governing body and executive managers, but also the organization as a whole, then maybe you need to start there first, rather than hitting brick walls. So, in conclusion, we have the start of what we might say is a test and learn process for the next 2 years. This was created, this is not empire building, this is not another owned thing. The reason why BSI and national standards bodies are so important is because they are a service to a society to create consensus around a topic. They are not owned by anyone. In reality, they're owned by all of us. So we can really all use all our wisdom, all our learning, and all the learning we will do trying to work with this in our organizations in the next 2 years to make the next iteration even better. And when, if, and not that long I hope, we might take this to an international level, we will be prepared to come together as a global community to say what this means. So please take this standard also to all your global contexts, because that's what we're trying to achieve. So, and it matters because, and when you read it, I'm sure you'll think it's very boring and specific and repetitive, but that is the nature. We need that level of clarity and precision if we are going to build accountability. And it's only with accountability that we will turn purpose washing into purpose action. So I, for one, am mightily pleased that we are now starting that process. Thank you. Oh, and the most important thing I was here to do is to introduce Polly Courtice, Dame Polly Courtice, who I've had the very great pleasure of working with at CISL, Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, but I know you also have a huge range of other roles and very much in the governing space. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Polly. Thank you so much.
And I invite the panel to come up and join us. Just going to invite the panel to join us before I get started.
Health and safety. I mean,
don't look down.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, John, and Victoria, for that wonderful opening. I think that really perfectly starts us off onto this next stage of discussion. I've been in the sustainability world now for 33 years, to be precise, and I was reflecting as I was reading the PAS over the weekend, and I just have to say, it's not boring. It's dense, but it is actually a brilliant piece of work. I was wondering why it's taken us so long. What is it about codifying this particular part of our process that has taken us so long? And looking back, I think it's because this is such an all-embracing, such a comprehensive, such a complex. It's just, I mean, if you're a sustainability wonk like me, you think everything fits under sustainability. So this is the PAS for everything in some ways. But of course, how you, the connection to purpose, I think, has really given sustainability a whole new language. You know, sustainability can be very, very abstract. It can be very hard to engage with. And suddenly now bringing it into why do you exist and why should we care? Why does your company exist and why do I have a right to do so? And why do you get out of bed in the mornings? That's really human. I know this is something that you feel deeply about, Sarah, which is around, you know, how do we humanize work? So it's hugely important, this process. But of course, moving from this fantastic ambition, which this statement lays out, to becoming something we do in practice, becomes part of the norm, becomes part of the culture, is where we are, we hope this path will go next. And we have an absolutely wonderful panel here who are going to offer some reflections about how are we going to build on this. What does this statement, this set of principles actually mean in practice? So we have three great panelists, and in the order in which they're going to speak, we have Sarah Mukherjee, who is the relatively new chair of the Institute for Environmental Management and Assessment, an organisation, a professional body, which actually offers resources right way around the world to help people engage with environment and sustainability. If you haven't spent time looking at what they do, they're a huge resource which many of us have drawn on over the years. And before that, Sarah was a BBC environmental journalist and has a huge wealth of experience in this area. Secondly, we have Sarah Gillard, who's even more recently taken up her role as the Chief Executive of Blueprint for Business, but before that was the Director of Purpose and Special Projects at John Lewis Partnership, and has trailblazed something pretty special at JLP, which I'm hoping we're going to be able to draw on today. And finally, Alex Plant, who is the Director of Strategy and Regulation at Anglian Water. I have to declare an interest. I'm on the board of both Anglian Water and BSI, so I think these two organisations are real trailblazers, but I think you'll see from when you hear what Alex has to say that this organisation has put purpose at the heart of its business in a really practical, operational way that we're going to hear a little bit more about today. So without further ado, let's start the conversation. Sarah M. Sarah, you have this huge swathe of professionals and organisations that turn to IEMA. It'd be really interesting just to get your feel for what difference you think this standard is going to make. What's different about this? This is new and innovative, but what difference will it actually make in practice to all those hundreds of people out there that you work with?
First of all, Victoria, I think you've done an amazing job, and thank you very much to BSI for doing this. I was on the Glover review of national parks, and you're thinking, oh, she's got a sugar loan at the moment. Why is she talking about that? But there's a similar conversation that goes on, I think, around beauty in terms of national parks. We never really know. It all sounds a bit fluffy, and we can't really. It's not a thing. We can't build it. We can't measure it. And I think this is why this is such an important move forward for everybody who's interested in running businesses sustainably and with genuine values, because it allows you, it gives you a metric to work against in terms of what you mean by purpose. I think it's really important for a number of ways, and we'll talk a little bit about the global aspect a bit later, but particularly for organisations that are really struggling with institutional bandwidth at the moment. I mean, big organisations are already having these discussions, and those of us in this space are, I know you are at Anglian, but there are lots of organisations who are really starting from a very, very low base, and to have this ready reckoner, I think, is going to be hugely important and helpful for the future.
So I was thinking particularly about SMEs who, I mean, the reality is we're not going to solve this existential crisis that we're facing without the corporate sector, but that means the whole corporate sector. And so bringing the SMEs on board, many of whom I've seen it firsthand, are massively time poor. I bet no one of the SME chief executives would have the time to read through that, nor should they. How does this has helped those companies to mainstream this or take it into their strategy, at the heart of the strategy, in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I mean, may you live in interesting times. How many more interesting times can you have as an SME, not only in the UK, but globally as well? This, and I think, maybe we can have a little discussion a bit later about working as a business sector with larger organisations supporting smaller ones as well. I mean, I think that peer-to-peer knowledge, and we know that, I mean, from my work in agriculture, farmers learn best from farmers. SMEs learn best when you have a peer-to-peer structure, and something like this document allows you to start that conversation. I mean, it's what, 50 pages without the extras, and I think really as a chief executive, I'm a chief executive of an SME as well. it behoves you to have conversations about this, which is not, lots of SMEs are very, very busy trying to do the day job, but there has to be room if you are to grow and develop and thrive and be resilient for these conversations as well. And I think this is a really good way of starting those conversations, peer-to-peer within your organisation and within your sector.
So Sarah, you must have seen that as an ambition in Blueprint to take the power of the big companies and drive it, support through into the smaller companies. Is this going to be a useful tool for you?
Hugely useful. I think, as Victoria said, you can't really have a conversation if you don't share a common language.
Yeah.
And having a set of terms that everybody understands what they mean by and can hold themselves to account for gives you a firm place to stand and something to aim for and something to hold yourself to account for. So incredibly useful to have that as a sort of written down article. But then I think, just building on what you said, one of the great things about the purpose sort of movement is that it's not really seen as a competitive issue that needs to be kind of secretly held by an organisation. So, if an organisation reads the powers, begins to implement it, what's incredible is the joy and willingness to share it with as many people as possible. So it's quite unusual in the business sense. I've spent 27 years working in retail, highly competitive, very aggressively so, but interestingly, the sort of journey to become a purpose-led organisation is not an area that people see as a competitively held secret. It's widely shared. So I think big organisations helping each other, helping smaller organisations, this sort of community of professionals who are able to do this and share with others is just growing really quickly.
And you led the purpose work in John Lewis Partnership. And we've talked a lot about the inextricable link between purpose and strategy. And I'm very interested in hearing from organisations the extent to which they influence one another. When you developed your purpose, did it change the strategy? Or was the strategy something which delivered the purpose? I'm particularly interested in any examples, but obviously John Lewis is a very good example.
Yeah, well, it is an interesting example because it's often held up as one of the originally sort of purpose-led organisations, and 100 years ago, that's definitely at the heart of why it was invented. But the reason that we did the work over the past 2 years, I still say we, I've only left there 2 months ago, so
You're allowed.
once a partner, always a partner. The reason that we did it is because purpose wasn't providing the driving force. It didn't define our success. It didn't shape our strategy. It didn't inform our culture in the way that we knew it ought to do. So we did a huge piece of listening work to try and reactivate it. And therefore, the purpose, we were also doing this during the pandemic, so strategy was being created sort of daily, but also there was a long-term strategic process going on, and they did inform each other. And I think that's actually why it's been so powerful, is the purpose work is totally interwoven with the strategic work and the cultural work that's happening, and it has redefined what the organisation is aiming for. So the strategic work is all flowing from quite a different articulation of what success looks like.
Yes, I think that idea of defining more precisely what success looks like in non-financial terms, which is what we, all of us, learning how to do. This is not something which is long-term familiar for many companies. I'm particularly interested in the fact that in order for this to really be embedded in the strategy, it has to be tied to remuneration. But the pain that everybody's going through now in trying to define what those metrics are, and it's good, healthy pain. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, because it does mean you have to think deeply about what you value and how different people contribute different things to the purpose of the organisation. Is that something which you've seen either? I'll come on to you in a moment, Alex, because I know this is a hot topic for you too, but I just wondered, Sarah, if either of you have seen this as a real hot debate of defining metrics.
Yes.
And will this PAS help?
Yeah, I think this PAS helps in, like I said, giving business a language that isn't just about the financial metrics, because typically with remuneration, if you can't measure it, it doesn't, it's not involved in the equation, and that's really quite difficult. So business is beginning to think more broadly about what does great performance look like, what are we looking for from people. So I think all of that will be informed by the PAS, but I think also really critically, acknowledging that humans, of course, are motivated by extrinsic things like pay, but the intrinsic motivation of feeling like you're doing a worthwhile job, that you're surrounded by people who are trying to do something worthwhile as well, that you're working collaboratively on something that has the ultimate ends in mind, it drives the levels of innovation and loyalty and engagement way beyond the financial incentives. So of course that's important, but it's only a partial view of how humans are motivated, and I think it's really important to acknowledge all of the ways in which humans respond to incentivization internally and externally.
And I'll build on that by also talking about, I mean, we all know how hot a market it is, particularly for young talent. And we find increasingly, I mean, within our individual members, corporates, and also our own staff team, that people are looking, especially if they're under 35, at an organisation that is led by its purpose, and that purpose is to do good in not just the area that they're based, but for the wider community. And I think this will be a really useful tool for businesses to be able to show intent to those really highly sought after, highly educated young people who are looking for a purpose-driven career.
Yeah. So Alex, I think one of the big moments for me in looking at Anglian Water when they really pinned their colours to the mast is when they changed the Articles of Association to actually lock in long-term social and environmental value, as well as responsibility to the shareholders, but lock it into the purpose of the company. Has that changed? I mean, what has it caused to change in the way people think about the company?
So, first of all, apologies for not being called Sarah.
No, well, it would have been a great deal easier.
I have a wife called Sarah.
Well, she can come next time.
So that journey, I think, was incredibly important. And I think when we were working with the board around that conversation, around do we change our articles, I think it wasn't because Anglian wasn't behaving in that way. It was. But our constitution as a company said we are there to maximise profits, full stop. I thought, well, hang on a minute, that's not what we're there to do, and it's not what we seek to do. So the change was to, as you rightly say, to lock in, embed that within the constitution of the company. And one of the reasons that's so important is it means that the current enlightened set of owners and enlightened set of managers could, in theory, be jettisoned for a less enlightened set of owners and managers next month, in theory. But by locking it into the constitution, it becomes almost impossible for that to change. And it also advertises to anyone who might wish to take a stake in the company at a future point that this is the company into which you are buying. This is the purpose that this company has. And that purpose is framed as being delivering environmental and social prosperity to the region we serve through our commitment to love every drop. And that is, as a monopoly provider of an essential service, what we should be doing, right? And that's kind of stating it there on the constitution of the company, and as a legal duty for all directors, I think is really important. But as we started to move through this, and we had a lot of conversations with wider stakeholders and politicians, the thing that kept coming back was, well, that's great, but how do we know? What's the accountability frame in the way that Victoria's putting it? So Andy Brown in my team and I spent a lot of time kind of going, well, okay, what do we do? And the reason we wanted to work with BSI as one of the lead sponsors of this work was it gave us the way in which you could then have an accountability framework and an independent assessment as to whether we were actually living up to the purpose we had set out in our constitution, and therefore could avoid the sort of purpose wash criticism that could flow. And so today is an incredibly exciting moment because I think it gives us that ability to do that. And what we have been trying to do, and we're not perfect, right? We are trying to find ways we can embed this into the way we work into all our decisions. So we have evolved a 6 capitals framework for decision making, but it's imperfect. We can't quite measure all the metrics as accurately as we would like to, but it is now in our decision making. It does come through in board papers. It is part of what is, Anglian trying to live up to the things that it says. And it just feels to me that there's never been a more important moment than now for this standard to exist, given the burning platform, particularly of climate change, but also I think of social inequity, with the cost of living crisis kind of putting a sharp focus on that. So this coming into being now, what I really hope is this becomes an inflection point. It becomes something whereby the standard corporate form moves to one that is purposeful. The standard is a way in which everyone can demonstrate whether they are living up to that or not. And that we move towards an 808 state. That's kind of what I want us to be at.
I'll get T-shirts made.
No, absolutely.
So one of the things that we know that this is going to depend on is if it's going to be embedded in strategy, it also has to be embedded in the culture of the organisation. And it would be interesting to hear from all three of you, what is it that really will signal you have a cultural shift? And how can you, because there will be people who will, notwithstanding the sincerity of the approach from the leaders and from the professionals who are leading this, who will see this as yet another initiative and it'll go away, and even if it's not just the chairman's pet project, haven't yet embraced this in the truly meaningful way that we need. What's going to help that? And I'm not talking about organisations that are well down the track. I'm talking about the many organisations, and Sarah, you must be helping lots of them, who know this is something they have to do, but haven't yet quite brought the team with them, haven't sold it into the system.
Well, we work, I mean, obviously in this space, but also on EDI, because as one of the few people of colour leading an organisation in this space, it is very undiverse, very white, very middle class. And we have run a series of workshops with our members of colour, and I said, well, what would you say is a measure of success? How would you, and I think there are parallels here. How would you feel about that, working for an organisation that you felt is actually taking this seriously? And they said, put it on the risk register. So the FinCom, AuditCom, and the board is looking at this every single time they meet. And I would say the same for this. I mean, if you want to be an organisation that's driving change, it has to be that everybody, the decision makers in the organisation are driving it. And so if it goes on the risk register as something that needs to be worked through and completed, then that's, and we found that certainly with our diversity and inclusion work. We have it on our risk register. Everybody who's making a decision in the organisation is looking at it regularly, and it's really driven change. We are far more representative of modern Britain than we were even 18 months ago.
Interesting.
Well, I think you have to pay attention, building that to the hardware and the software of the organisation. So the hardware, you've got to look at the processes. What does the business case template say? What's on the front of the board pack? What's your recruitment website look like? Is it in your articles of association? Are you talking about this to attract people to your organisation? What's the induction like when they arrive? What's the progression and incentivisation, and who gets promoted? So all of that kind of hardware processes, you really need to kind of do a deep dive and make sure that it's all aligned and what you say is valuable is actually being valued. And then in the software, of course, it's about the stories that you tell, the heroes and heroines of the organisation, the way that you're demonstrating constantly in how you show up as a leader in the organisation and throughout what's important to you. And that's the cultural stuff that's really hard to pinpoint. And it's sort of, you can discern it from conversations and surveys and really listening to the organisation, but it's quite hard to kind of measure. But you do feel, I mean, we're humans, we feel
Feel it in the...
Feel it, you do. And I think recognising that that's a valuable metric, actually, the feeling inside the organisation and whether people feel safe, included, inspired, able to take risks, able to collaborate. It's a really critical part of whether an organisation is going to be successful in the long run. So both are important, hardware and software.
I think that's right, Sarah. I think the point, I mean, actually in Anglian, every time any of the senior members of the company speak about anything, we frame it with purpose. So the issue might be leakage, but we start by purpose, and then it kind of flows through. So every external communication is framed in that way. All of our publications are framed in that way. An annual report out today is framed in that way. So that's sort of part of your, you must get the hardware right. I think where it really comes through, though, and this is some of the bits I've been proudest of since we've been on this journey, is that in the workshops we're doing with our teams, and right down to the most junior levels, people will challenge as to whether the decision that we're thinking about is consistent with our stated purpose. And that's possibly easier in an organisation that has a strong public service ethos anyway and always has done. But in all organisations, people get out of bed, to John's point right at the beginning, they don't get out of bed to maximise profits, really. They get out of bed to do something that's valuable. And of course you need profits along the way to maintain the sustainability of the company. But they get out of bed because they want to make a great meal for someone if you're working in a restaurant. deliver a great service in some form, you know, do something valuable in society. And therefore it's always there. So if you can really unlock that and kind of give full vent to it, then the cultural shift comes from top down and bottom up, and then it really is a kind of purposeful organisation.
So this standard, I think, is going to raise expectations out there, rightly so. I mean, it's one of the points of this, and I'm interested in what you think is going to come next. Once you're out there, we're a purpose-driven organisation. No purpose washing here. We've adopted the standard. We're following its principles. There are a group of stakeholders out there who are rightly going to say, is that far enough and what's next? Do you have a sort of sense as to the direction of travel that this is going to take us? We know that this is an iterative process, but we know also that for no matter how hard organisations try, there is a very, very long way to go for almost all of us. And the question is, how do we ratchet this up? Alex?
So one of the things I think is that this is something that is not about philanthropical decisions being made by organisations. This is actually something that becomes a source of advantage if you've done it well. Because back to your point about recruitment, I mean, the labour market's never been tighter. If you are not perceived as being a good organisation, you're much less likely to be able to recruit people, as you say. The other thing I think it really has the potential to do, if we can get the movement going and it starts to become the norm, as I was talking about earlier, is it does two things. One is it can unleash the power and resources of the private sector to lean into the most acute problems of facing society. Because governments can't do that on their own. There's not sufficient resource sat in government sectors, either through legislation, to make this work. But if more of the heavy lifting can be done in the boardroom to deliver these outcomes, then we've got half a chance of addressing the climate change and social challenges that we face. The flip side advantage, if we could really get this moving, is that regulation in all its forms is currently heavy, partly because there is a perception from the regulatory state that the corporate sector are seeking to basically behave badly unless
drag
we
their
stop
heels.
them, right? Yeah. And therefore it becomes very heavy. You're a would-be criminal, I must be a policeman. If this really works, then it frees up the regulatory state to do less of that heavy stuff, which actually kind of constrains innovation and stops things from moving forward, and allows it to be repurposed towards a much more collective endeavour to address these things. And that's the bit that's really, really exciting for me about all of this, if that can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Giving some frameworks for those outside stakeholders to look at what you're doing and let you get on with doing it.
Differently about their roles as a result, yeah.
Anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of catchphrase that I was using a lot is that purpose becomes a driver, not a filter.
Yeah.
If it's seen as a filter, it feels like a restraint, and what can't I do? And does that mean that it's some kind of zero-sum game between purpose and profit? And if a business approaches it in that mindset, which to be honest, many do, it will always be seen as a filter through which you're trying to kind of get otherwise commercially, advantageous decisions through. I think, we'll know that this is becoming successful when purpose is seen as truly a driver, and that it's creating this kind of pull for innovation and talent and what's possible. And business is at its best when it's innovating and inventing for the future rather than responding to constraint or regulation. So the flip of this to a driver, I think, is going to be the goal that we're aiming for.
Sarah, I know that IEMA has members all over the world, and this standard is a national standard. I'm very interested in, and we talked about worldviews and values, I'm very interested in whether you think it's managed to deal with the sense that other parts of the world don't see challenges in the same way. They don't experience them in the same way, and whether you can see whether this standard is going to, and whether purpose generally is going to land globally.
I think we're very much at the start of the conversation. I mean, we're very aware. We're having a conference for our members at the end of this year, and unusually, for we haven't done this before. We are handing over big sections of the conference to our members around the world. And we have big groups in Sub-Saharan Africa, MENA, Caribbean, for example. And it's, I'll be honest, it's a very different conversation. It's about how are we going to manage all this waste that you are sending
Dumping
us
on
in
us.
the West. we are very much closer to food and farming. I think there was a lot of surprise that we didn't have a food and farming day in COP26 because of the global issue and how that affects climate change. But that doesn't mean that, you know, it would be, I think, presumptuous to assume that because people are in a very different space in different parts of the world, this doesn't matter, because it does. You know, if you're interested in sustainability and protecting and making your own country resilient, there is obviously a conversation around purpose.
And it's being driven down the supply chain, presumably, which is back to the earlier point that it's going to be required.
Yes, and all the more important, I mean, I don't want to say, you know, big business, this is your problem, but all the more important for businesses who are involved in long and complex supply chains to share this knowledge and information and have those discussions, work in partnership rather than thinking, who's the cheapest guy out there? Yeah, well, we'll pick you. Regardless of what of the conversations you have about purpose or resilience. It's not, I mean, to be fair, I just don't think that is how most large organisations are framing this anymore.
No, that's probably right.
Sorry, I thought, did you want to come in?
No, I was going to say, I think it's probably right. It's becoming something whereby if you're a larger organisation, you've got this embedded in what you're doing, it also flows through into your conversations with your supply chain, because you almost can't not.
Yeah.
And I think there is a responsibility for larger organisations to lean in and work with SMEs in particular to try to actually, you know, take some of the burden, because, you know, we've had the luxury, I suppose, of being able to be a lead sponsor for this work. If I was an SME, there's no way I could do that. But therefore, how do we make sure that we spread this and help our SMEs to, and particularly in our supply chain, but even outside of our supply chain, to think about what they can do given the more constrained resources that they have.
And to your point about regulation, and we're not just, you know, companies cannot and are not just sitting around twiddling their thumbs waiting for someone to come down with a big regulation from the mountain to provide you, or here's the solution. You can't, you know, things are moving too fast. You have to be more agile than that. And also, regulators like to see mature organisations coming up with solutions of their own, which they've worked in collaboration with others.
So I'm often asked whether I'm optimistic. And I won't tell you what the answer is, because it depends on what day, depends on what day I get out of bed, which side of the bed I get out of. And our initiatives like this giving you more optimism, and are you still filled with the sense that almost everything we do isn't enough?
Yeah,
Sarah.
funnily enough, we run I'll jump feet first into this one. We have a podcast, monthly podcast, and I always ask our guests that, and they are all optimists. And I don't think you can, I mean, I think the best answer I think one gave was short-term pessimist, long-term optimist. And I don't think you can be working in this sector and in this area without being optimistic. There is so much going on, so many really, you know, fascinating, amazing, inspirational businesses and ideas out there, and of which I think this is one. So yes, I mean, I think probably I'm on the short-term pessimist, long-term optimist end of the spectrum.
Who wants to go next? Sarah?
I'm at the extreme optimist end of the spectrum. Although with a kind of realistic view of what's actually going on at the moment and the scale and the urgency of what's required, I think a lot of the barriers or perceived barriers for organisations to become more purpose-led have just been blown away. I think, you know, when you've got a situation where your investors, your employees, your customers, your suppliers, the communities that you work with, your regulators, everybody's saying, do you know what, we really should be moving in this direction. You know, the barriers are just melting away, and I think the last 2.5 years have really accelerated that. I think businesses have been operating in a paradigm, and we have just seen that paradigm completely dissolve, and we're now consciously creating the new one. And I think that conscious shaping of the paradigm in which organisations operate is extraordinary. It's never happened before in human history. And the care and the thought and the future vision that is being brought to shaping that paradigm, I do think it's going to happen very quickly. I know it doesn't perhaps feel quick enough, but these things aren't linear. And I think catalysts, like the pandemic, with all of its horrible consequences, but it was a catalyst for business to rethink, why are we here? Why should we survive? What's our role in helping? Let's focus on the relationships that we have. I mean, I think that was a huge difference in the pandemic, is businesses suddenly started looking at all of the human relationships that they that they had and taking care of them. I think the PAS is another catalyst. I think these catalysts are kind of firing off, and it won't be a linear progression. I think business, once it gets its teeth into stuff, ramps up pretty quickly.
Great. Alex?
So, where am I? I don't think I'm as optimistic. I hope you're right that it snowballs, because it has to. And that's, I suppose, part of my reason for caution, is that it feels that the pace of change needed is so rapid, and therefore the snowball is critical. The other reason I'm a bit more pessimistic is that in an ideal world you'd have the business sector driving really fast towards this, and you'd have public governance in lockstep. And I feel pretty gloomy about the public governance situation, not just in the UK, but actually particularly in the UK just at the moment. And I maybe that's still short term, and maybe I should be optimistic about the longer term, but I just worry about the damage that's been done to trust in public institutions that has been the result of the last sort of several years, and that's why I'm a bit more pessimistic, because I'm nervous about what that means.
I used to get my biggest dose of optimism from young students at Cambridge. Just spending time with them is so amazing. But actually in recent years, I think, just to pick up on the point that you made, Sarah, it's not just young people now demanding it. It's everywhere I go, and of course we're a very, very small minority when you look at the global challenges we face, but dyed-in-the-wool, old-fashioned leaders are now stepping up and saying, do you know what, I better get on with this agenda and help me. And that's what I think is so useful here. There's help available now. In fact, if anything, there's too much help available. It's how do you choose the right help? But anyway, that's another problem. But it's terrific that this standard is one of those aids to change, that people know it's coming. They better get on with it. So now we have time for some questions. Victoria, I'd love you to come and join us here, and we can take questions from the floor. Are we taking questions online? No questions online. Phew, that means I don't have to manage the technology. Yes, I'm just going to get the mic to you. And can you say where you're from, so that we just get a feel for your...
Andrew Westall, involved in sustainability standards at BSI as well as other things. So, and I've been involved in this area, probably like everybody, for a long time. And just to say congratulations, because it could be a game changer, and that's really important. So the really tricky question, which is, yes, I'm optimistic from the organisational point of view. The one area where I think the barrier is that is really difficult is around finance, because over the years, all of the organisations that have really been trying to kind of do this have struggled. So that idea of what appropriate profit is a little people talking about it, but is it real? So what's interesting is you've got private investors at Anglian Water, right? Now, the question has got to be, how many investors are willing to accept appropriate return? Because if you're listed, then the pressures on you, or the VC pressures to deliver what probably is accepted as being more return than is strictly kind of realistic, is there. And I think the finance industry needs to be engaged in this just as much. Otherwise, I think that is the biggest barrier. I don't want to be sceptical, but I'd like to know how you see this moving forward.
Hugely important point. Victoria, you want to come in, and then I'll bring you in.
Say, in an optimistic note, because obviously I do a lot of work with CISL, and CISL does a lot of work with the investment and the finance industry. And I've been involved with CISL for sort of 7-8 years. In the last 3 or 4, it has done this. I mean, it's incredible, incredible to see the proportions. Just on the postgraduate certificate the other day, 30% were from the finance sector. So this is something that is real and present. You also have a lot of faith-based financial institutions starting to realise that this is a lens in which they can think about. It's not going to take long until we take the definitions of fiduciary duty, the doctrine of good faith, materiality, and we take the word financial decision out of there, and we just say decision, and so suddenly it'll be, oh, hang on a minute, so you told me I should invest in this because I'd get a financial return, but you didn't disclose to me the information about how this would actually destroy my future. I think that is in the room. I think we're going to see big changes.
I mean, certainly I've sat on lots of panels with financial people moving huge amounts of money around the world, who are now having to completely revise what they think of as a 25-year return on investment for a big infrastructure project. say, in Brazil, you know, you can't guarantee it's even going to be there now in 5 or 10 years. And that really does begin to concentrate minds. And so, you know, I mean, the amount of money we're talking is so immense. I absolutely get your point, but I do think that the lights have been going on, you know, slowly, but it's beginning to pick up speed, and people are really worried about, you know, how we can even plot this future when it's so uncertain.
Quick comment from Alex, and then we've got another question over here.
I suppose in some ways we had because it's privately held, it's different to the listed situation we're describing. And primarily pension fund investors with a longer term sort of focus and a patience to their capital, if you like. And it was a long conversation with the board. It wasn't an instant thing to make the move we did. But I think there was a recognition from all of our, well, it was a unanimous decision, all of our investors recognised that what was being proposed here was something actually, if you think about it from a long-term perspective, gave you a better, safer, more secure long-term return, potentially sometimes at the sacrifice of a shorter-term gain, and it's sort of somewhere in the calculation. I think the other bit that sort of helps, particularly from a pension fund point of view, is that they've got their own expectations around governance and corporate behaviours which need to flow through into the stocks that they then hold. So the ESG bit of this is helpful. The final thing I'd say is that in relation to a company with a large amount of debt, as we do, most of our activities are funded through debt and some through equity, our ability to demonstrate purpose helps us to get into access to debt funding at a much lower rate, because essentially all of our funding is now green finance, and the coupon for that green finance is lower than other sources of debt finance. So it's back to my kind of enlightened self-interest, not philanthropy, that is in here. But you have to think about it long run, and that's the thing that I think is perhaps the most tricky bit of this. But I'm really encouraged by what Victoria was saying about, you know, the step change in the level of interest in this from the finance community itself.
And just very briefly, I think it's a really great point. If we think about that triangle, an organisation can be purpose-driven and have enlightened, so operating middle and bottom of the triangle, stakeholders that get the reality, knowing that the organisation itself is putting something meaningful beyond profit, but they are just saying, actually, this is just a good bet.
And that plays into both debt finance and equity finance.
Yeah.
So you start to get a virtuous circle with all of that if it works.
It's interesting. I mean, I agree with you. The finance sector has moved dramatically. I would say 5 years. We saw it kind of escalating, but last 3. I don't know how much they are, any of them really have purpose at the heart of their business. They're very interested in where the purpose is playing out in their investments, but that's another whole story. Yes.
Thank you. Tom Levitt, I'm an independent writer and consultant on responsible business. I sat on BS 8950 with Victoria and indeed with Andrea.
Social value, that was.
Social value, yes. I'm also a former parliamentarian, and you made a few points about legislation. There's a campaign going on out there called the Campaign for a Better Business Act.
Yes.
Now, my feeling about that is that legislation breeds a compliance culture. It follows good practice rather than leads it, and it's a hell of a long time in coming. How much of this can be achieved without legislation, and do you see a positive role for legislation in supporting this?
Yeah, it's something we've spent quite a bit of time thinking about, and we've worked with Better Business Act. I mean, we made the change voluntarily and have tried to talk about it because we think it's something that, at least in utilities, ought to be replicated. I've been in two minds about the legislative aspect, partly for the reasons you say. However, I think I've come down on saying, actually, 172 has itself been quite useful, but it never got fully implemented. There were some aspects of 172 that kind of held back during the Blair Brown government time when it was first introduced. And if you could just push that bit further, which is where the Better Business Act campaign is going, I think on balance, I'm in favour of, I see the potential downsides, compliance culture and all the other things, but on the whole, I'd go for it, I think, and to create, as part of that, making the standard model become one that is more recognisably a responsible form of capitalism. And I think I would therefore take some steps in the lines that the Better Business Act is arguing for.
Yeah, it's rather like, I mean, everything in the climate change space is everything and that as well. So I was really surprised, actually, when I took this. I've been in this role for a couple of years, at how much faster the private sector was moving than legislators were. Bearing in mind that we had, you know, the globally the first ever climate change act, you know, and you know, getting cross-party support, well, that was, you know, unbelievable, really. But still, it's now behind the pace. So I would say that I've been really inspired by the agility and the, you know, once an organisation collectively comes to the decision that you need to do something about it, it happens really quite quickly. But you also need, you know, these all have quite long tails, and there's a fairly long tail of businesses who haven't got the memo. You probably need extra supportive regulation to help them move up the curve as well.
I think it's also a question of rebuilding trust.
Yes.
Because for a very, very long time we trusted that companies would do the right thing, and we were shown to be, our trust was in many cases misplaced. And so this purpose agenda, I think, where there's a degree of accountability, is going to help to build that retrust.
Yeah.
We've got a question there, but a quick comment from
I
Victoria.
was just going to say, we're actually, again, CISL, we're doing a big global project with DLA Piper on what are the trends and barriers around bringing forward this future that we need in legislation globally. So to try to say, because it's really hard to get a sense of how fast legislation is moving across the world, but also to say is that one of the really great things about this standard is it hasn't started by saying what's the feasible pragmatic reality based on current legislation. It's like, what's the future, what's the organisations we need to build, now let's try and get the legislation to support it. So it holds a mirror up, and it's something for all of us to consider, to say to what extent does our legislative and regulatory environment enable this or actually get in the way of it. And that, now we have the specificity, we can have a much more detailed conversation.
Better conversations. A question here, a question at the back, and then one from John. And then, so can I just check with whoever's in charge here how much longer we can run over, given that we started a little late? We need to end at 9:55.
Shall we
Can we end on the hour?
Can we end on the hour because we started late?
Oh,
oh yes, that's right. Yeah. Shall we do all the questions at the?
Yeah, let's get all the questions in the room, and then we will do our best to get through them as best we can. So here we are, the first one.
Okay, thank you very much, panelists. And this is really exciting for a national standard to be launched. My name's Pat Dwyer, and I run a company called The Purpose Business out of Hong Kong, Manila, and Singapore. And we help companies basically, we guide leaders to evolve business as a force for good. And we've always believed that when you activate purpose, you go from a sort of do less harm and do more good. And when we work with companies, they always ask us, well, I'm an SME, you know, like 7 years ago when I founded this, everybody said, good luck with your charity, or profit is my purpose. But even today, even with the Enlightenment, even with next generation leaders leading their businesses, purpose is still seen as a luxury because there's gazillion other frameworks, there's gazillion other ISOs to contend with and competing priorities. So SMEs would ask us, what are the best examples of big organizations? And Sarah, thank you for putting that out, you know, the peer-to-peer sharing. What have you seen as good examples of big organizations sponsoring purpose down their value chain? You know, really bringing up suppliers into the discussion, but also changing policies and changing the experience. Would love to hear that from anyone. Thanks.
Great. So we'll hold that question around purpose as a luxury and driving it down the supply chain in a meaningful way. Yes.
Hi, my name is Anisha Shah. I'm with Blurred and ESG and Purpose Consultancy. Our proposition is that ESG and purpose are really two sides of the same coin, so it's really difficult for an organization to talk about or claim to do good in the world without first proving that they do no harm. How do you see this standard fitting with proving that organizations don't do any harm and really bringing together the P with the ESG, very technical aspects of showing that you cause no harm to society and the environment?
Great. These are big, chunky questions, so we'll have to see how we...
I can answer that one really quickly. The bottom of the means, the two means principles are all about the bottom of the triangle. They are all about operating within those thresholds.
Sorry, Polly, I was going to say, the reason we were going to finish early because I had a meeting at 10, but in fact, I've just been told on my watch it's been cancelled. So, so I am not going to be the party pooper. Yes, thank you.
So
thank you, Tech. Yes.
So we'll break at 1 o'clock. Right. Yes.
Ed Gamble, Scientist for Warning Europe, but I'm also a Buckinghamshire councillor, actually. I loved Alex's comment on 808 state, and I'm going to try and remember that and use it again. But that leads me on to talking about how this might apply to national governments, and particularly when you've got planet right at the top of it, and most national governments don't seem to think too much about planet, and particularly in the context that we've got a dozen Conservative contestants for the leadership who haven't mentioned planet or climate or biodiversity once in any of their speeches. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't actually remember one. So I'd just like to ask how this might apply to them.
Yeah. Actually, they have mentioned it, and they're going to dumb it down, so that's another thing. Come back to that. There was John, I think, and was right. So John.
Yeah. It was a statement rather than a question, but it was a question about how much legislation, how much. I always make comparisons between this kind of stuff and health and safety. When health and safety became something of a more important issue than it had been, it was seen as a pain in the backside by large and small organisations. And it goes up an engineering curve and is now part of a licence to operate. Yeah. And it needed just the right amount of legislation, but it needed a massive shift of people's perceptions. And so does this. And until we get this to be perceived as licence to operate, we're still climbing the hill.
Yeah. Yeah. This must be core to your blueprint work, Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the environment is changing very quickly. And as we've talked about, not only the pressure from investors and employees and customers and all the rest of it, and regulators, but the opportunity that's opening up in terms of organisations seeing their role in creating a flourishing planet and humans that are happy and well. That shift in mindset is the thing that's going to generate the activity. Of course, the regulation and provides a floor. That's a really important thing for the laggards on that curve. Yeah. But we're not really aiming at the laggards. Humanity progresses because it looks at the innovators and it sort of wants to be them. And that's really where a lot of the sort of energy and excitement is coming from. Is there's more people in that innovator, early adopter category. And we're about to cross the chasm to the early majority, and that's when the tipping point and the inflection point that I think you talked about really begins to shift.
I'll let panel members pick on any of those questions that they fancy answering.
There's a gentleman right at the back as well.
Okay, you and Alex can do the government one.
So I think there's one more question.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see you at the back there. Beg your pardon.
No problem. One more. Is this on? One more quick one. My name's Ben. I work for.
I don't think it is on. Actually, I can't.
Just shout.
Just be loud, Ben. I work for a purpose-driven consultancy called Gillard.
Hello, Ben.
My question is a simple one, but maybe quite a difficult one to answer. We've got a wide range of brands in various different sectors and a really diverse representation of roles within organisations. So who takes this forward? What role within the organisation would be responsible for driving the purpose agenda?
I can take that one.
Yeah,
right, who was? Seems a queue up for wanting to answer that one.
Go on, Sarah.
Which one? Go on, Sarah, and then I'll come to you, Victoria, and then to you, Sarah.
So I'll take the last one first, simply because I can't remember the other ones. I think it's a really interesting question, and what we're seeing, of course, is that the catalyst for purpose inside an organisation can come from anywhere. It might come from the CEO, it might come from the chair, it might come from the grassroots, it might come from a sustainability professional, an HR professional, a strategy professional, a finance professional. Marketing, brand, proposition, procurement is coming from anywhere. And I think the power is to recognise that. I don't think there's any other business field of interest that can include literally all of the functions of an organisation. And when that's recognised and utilised to sort of power the thing, it begins to kick off. So certainly at JLP, at the John Lewis Partnership, the recognition that at the minimum this was strategy, finance and HR coming together and saying, well, let's actually create a joint strategy so that, what we set out as being what we're trying to achieve, the strategy that we use to achieve it, and the culture and environment that we create are actually working in harmony, and it's all driven by the purpose. It was a bit of a revelation, and then all of the other functions join. So the catalyst can come from anywhere, but you actually have to involve all of the functions.
So I'm going to let Sarah add to that, and then I'm going to come back to you and Alex on the government question, because I think this is important right now that we... I'm sorry to...
No, absolutely.
I'm mindful of I've got my 3 minutes left. So,
so I'll be really...
And then, yes, then there's purpose as luxury, and how we take that.
Yes, so we did a little bit of work with Deloitte recently about looking at sustainability and how you not only check your own organisation to see how sustainable you are, but do some gap analysis. It's available, it's free online to anybody. Have a look at the website. And I think the same is for purpose as well. Actually, I don't think this works unless everybody's involved in it. And you need to do a gap analysis within your own organisation as to who's got the memo and who hasn't. I've used that already, but you know what I mean. And actually, it has to come from every single direction. It can start, absolutely to Sarah's point, somewhere, but unless you're embedding this across every single bit, because everybody will have something, a part to play, and everybody can be your ambassador externally to other organisations. And if you are going to work closely and in partnership with your supply chain, it does have to be every function in the organisation has to have this embedded.
Sarah, do you have any good examples in answer to the question of whether this, what does it really look like down the supply chain? Do you have any good examples of where it has really moved the dial as opposed to being simply seen as a burden?
I'm looking upwards because I'm thinking, to be perfectly honest, we work with hundreds of different organisations, and I think they are all in a stage of the journey. I wouldn't say, oh, do you know what, they've absolutely nailed it. There are lots of organisations that are working in bits of the supply chain, but I think it's difficult to point. I don't know if Sarah's got any example to point to one.
Alex, so you
So
can take that one and then build on the government.
Anglian, but it is a practical example, which is around how we moved a very significant reduction in carbon, because essentially we made it a requirement for our supply chain that they demonstrated to us that they were delivering things not just in terms of financially efficient, but in carbon efficient ways. And as soon as we injected carbon as a requirement into that relationship with our supply chain, the results were rapid and impressive, and it's driven through. And then of course that's tier 1 supply, but then it rolls through into tier 2 and tier 3. So that's been the last 10 years in Anglian. We're beginning to see that more widely as we're thinking about purpose, so it goes beyond carbon and picks up the 6 capitals framework generally. So then it stops being a luxury and starts becoming the way you have to do business.
Yeah, and I would say ultimately, as you're driving things down the supply chain, if you don't, at some point, the light's going to go on and say, well, we could keep putting pressure on our suppliers for all these different things, or we could actually work with them and help them unlock purpose so that they can solve multiple things at once. Because one of the hard things and painful things to watch is everyone trying to do no harm, which in the current circumstances is really tough, but without the purpose to drive the innovation, so they're kind of trapped in this filtering for massive change. So that's what I would say on that. I also just wanted to say, government. I think, we have criticised some of the stuff that's been going on currently within the elections and recently. But I think it's so important that this is not political. This is not left. It's not right. It's whatever those things were and might have meant. I think we're moving into a different area. But this is something that government really needs to look at. Because if government is not purpose-driven, how do we deliver? And as citizens, we are the ultimate governing body, and we need to make sure that our government is purpose-driven. Because if they're not working for our long-term well-being, for everyone, what is it that's happening, and are we okay with that? So that's what I would say, and it could be applied also for universities. And we have to recognise that middle of the triangle I presented. That's not just business. We've all become about counting the beans. So I would say that. There was another question.
I have got another Ministry of Justice, but I'll tell you about that after.
One thing on the government thing,
yes.
quickly, because you're a councillor as well. So I think that government question is a local government as well as a central government question. And you're absolutely right. One would expect that governments of all sorts, or those seeking office, on this agenda, it starts to become a unifying theme, because it is not, as you say, a traditional ideological split, or shouldn't be. But in the end, there is an accountability for all governments, whether that's a local government or a central government, in the form of the electorate. And if the electorate, who I think is appraised of the importance of this, is recognising that their elected representatives are not delivering on it, well, the ballot box votes them out.
And actually, we can use, as citizens, the past to turn around and say, you're just giving a strategy. Tax is a strategy. A strategy for what? What are we hoping it will achieve? What are the fundamental worldviews sitting under that? Do we as society believe those things? What do we really believe? And this is where we need, ultimately the accountability will come to there. So I see this as an encompassing standard that we can all use to hold accountability for all our organisations and systems to be working for our common good.
Those 808 state T-shirts are going to be
Exactly, they're going to be available online tomorrow.
I'm leaving my job and going to sell.
Okay, so I, in a desperate attempt to end on time, I think I'd like to thank this wonderful panel, Victoria, for your amazing contribution today and in the past, for all the people who were involved in developing this PAS. A huge amount of work went into it, and it was worth every minute. Thank you all for coming today, and for those of you online who've joined us, and thank you, Stephanie, for hosting us here at JAL. It's great. You now have a 30-minute coffee break. Wonderful chance to network with the incredible people in the room here, and then into the workshops. The workshops, Bennett, are back in here.
For those that can join us.
For those that can join.